I want to thank everyone for coming out here today, both in our live audience as well as those who are watching from their homes on YouTube. It's a real pleasure to be here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and we have an amazing panel for you. My name is Kevin Lynn. I am the co-founder of the Center for Progressive Urban Politics, and several years ago, Steve Lamb and I founded CFPUP.org, really to have that conversation about politics that pierces the veil of all that smog and fog that is out there. It's almost like a fog of war, and really get away from left versus right, conservative versus liberal, and look to what's prudent for in terms of helping decide what the best course of action for us, either at the national level, state level, or the community level is. And today, as I said, we have an amazing panel, and they're going to give a lot of insight into that. But before I begin, I'd like to, one, thank our sponsor for this event, and that is Progressives for Immigration Reform, whose without generous financial support, we couldn't have made this possible today. And I would also like to talk about another organization that some of the proceeds from the ticket sales will go to, and that is Respect Farmland, a watchdog group for Lancaster County. And Respect Farmland is an amazing group of activists who, late last year, came together initially to stop the construction of a 600-home development that threatened 75 acres of prime farmland here in Lancaster County. And the great thing is, we were successful. And since then, activists at Respect Farmland have been approached by people from other townships to assist also in fighting development that threatens farmland. And so really glad to be able to assist that group whenever we can. And now I'd like to introduce our panel today. And I'm going to start from left to right in alphabetical order. And I'm going to start with John Michael Greer. And John is an author and blogger and author of such works as Dark Age America and Retrotopia. And John, but those are only the latest. You've written 42 books up to this point. And I first got exposed to your writings and your books and your blog because every week John does a blog that is really a novella. But it's so informative. And last year, January 2016, when you had all the prognosticators and the mainstream media and everywhere else predicting who would be president in January 2017, you said it was going to be Donald Trump. And it was prophetic. And the reason you gave was he was the only one paying attention to the issue of class warfare. And we're going to get into that today. So again, John, it's a real pleasure to have you here.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. And our next panelist is James Howard Kunstler. And I got exposed, like many people, to Jim's work when you did that TED Talk on how bad architecture is destroying American cities. And it was an amazing piece, the candor that you have. I've since read your books, such as The Geography of Nowhere, as well as The Long Emergency. And I'm a faithful follower of your blog, whose name, well, I guess I could say it, but,
Well, don't.
But it's an amazing blog, and you're doing that now 2 times a week, which is
Mondays and Fridays.
it's just an amazing task. And one thing I want to bring your attention to before we begin, Jim, is I'm sure there's a point where the panelists on this stage and other activists, you ask the question, am I making a difference? What's the purpose here? And several years ago, when I lived in Los Angeles, I had taken my bicycle in to get repaired by this fellow named Joe Braille. And we got talking, and some of the conversation turned to James Howard Kunstler. And so we're going online and pulling down videos and everything. And this guy was he was an activist for bike lanes and new urbanism. And 2 years ago, in 2015, he cut his hair and he ran for city council of Los Angeles in CD1. And 2 weeks ago, there was an election in Los Angeles. And in a four-way race, now it's a runoff that's the way they don't have primaries, they have a runoff election there. And Joseph was taking on an entrenched politician who'd been on the scene for 35 years in California politics. And the result was there's going to be a runoff election now between Joseph and this fellow Gil Cedillo. And it's just amazing. And I think the chances are very good that Joe is going to win that election. And so that was someone who was deeply influenced by your writing.
Well, that settles it. I'm going to get a haircut.
Great, and turning my attention, Chris Martenson. Chris is an author, blogger. You have a site, peakprosperity.com, which I encourage everyone to visit. You've written 2 books, The Crash Course, which is how I became familiar with you, and recently Prosper, which is you kind of lay out, ways to course correct, to better prepare for what's coming. And Chris is also, and when you read your work, it's very easy to comprehend and get your head around. But you come at it with such a strong academic background. You have your MBA from Cornell, your PhD from Duke, and your postgraduate work from Duke. And so it shows, because I'm a big fan of your podcasts that come out every other week, usually. We can count on those to be out. And I know you got into town yesterday, and before you left, you did a podcast before you left. So you're always working.
Right, from the PhD and MBA to having a blog. So don't ask me about career advice.
But we will ask you for advice on how to prepare for the upcoming crash. Great, and next is Frank Morris. And Frank, I'm going to have to read this because your academic credentials are so long. And
No, you don't have to read it. We've been around a long time, so.
Right. Frank and I do go back a long way. But Frank, you hold degree. You got your bachelor's from Colgate, your MBA from Syracuse, or your MBA, and your doctorate from MIT. And then somewhere you got a degree from Georgetown as well.
Yeah.
And Frank, we've worked I consider Frank you to be a friend and a mentor of mine. We've been involved as activists on different issues for the past 8 years, and you just bring so much gravitas to any work that we're doing.
Because I'm a big guy, Kev.
Well,
big body.
For instance, Frank, you specialize in immigration, poverty, environmental, higher education issues. You're the former executive director of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, former dean of graduate studies at Morgan State University, former associate dean at the Graduate School of Public Affairs, University of Maryland, and a former senior foreign service officer with the Agency for International Development. And it was interesting. I was actually out in Los Angeles just a couple weeks ago, and I met a woman who I'd met through Facebook because she was sharing a video of you from YouTube. And she's like, "Oh my God, I love Frank Morris. He's just so bright." And I messaged her back. I said, "I know Frank Morris." And came back, "OMG, you know Frank Morris." So it's really great to have you here, Frank.
Thank you, Kev.
And last but surely not least is Dmitry Orlov. And Dmitry is an author and blogger, and he's the author of books such as Shrinking the Technosphere, and Reinventing Collapse. And I first got exposed to you with Reinventing Collapse, where you took a look at what happened you had gone back to chronicle what had happened in the Soviet Union, and began to draw parallels for how that could help us with our upcoming
collapse preparedness.
Collapse preparedness. And you're also an engineer as well as an author. I would like to direct people to your blog site, which is cluborlov.com. And you're also not just an author, but a publisher as well with the Club Orlov Press. And it's a real pleasure to have you here today, Dmitry.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
So how about a big hand for all of our panelists? This is actually going to be the most easy moderator job a person could have, because I don't think that you have to say much of anything to get this group of people started. So, but I would like to start off with the what do they call it, the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room, or the elephant in the room. On January 20th, Donald Trump became the 45th president of the United States. And I'd like to ask the panel, what happened? Why did he win? And what were the forces at work that propelled him into the presidency?
Well, I'd like to start. I'd like to
Sure.
take that, if you don't mind, just for starters. In some ways, this is one of those really overdetermined situations. It's like the victim in a bad mystery novel who gets shot and stabbed and poisoned and clubbed over the head and then thrown off a 20-story window into the sea. There were a lot of factors leading to Trump's victory, some of which, of course, I talked about in advance. But the two factors that I think deserve headliner here is, first of all, the simple fact that Hillary Clinton ran probably the least competent presidential campaign in my lifetime. And I've been watching presidential campaigns since Hubert Humphrey. Okay? She did an abysmally bad job in trying. She never gave the American people any reason to think that they would be improved by having her in the White House, by their situation would be better, that their lives would be better, outside of a small inner circle of affluent people whose lives are doing pretty well anyway. So her campaign was dismally bad. And probably almost anybody could have defeated her the way things were run. And of course, the worst thing is she ran an identical campaign in 2008 and lost then too. So she's not exactly good at learning from her mistakes. But the broader factor at work here is simply that so many people desperately needed change, which was one thing that she was not willing to provide or not willing to promise or offer. She was the candidate of business as usual. I want to just, not to monopolize too much, I want to tell just a very brief story here. Because I live in the north central Appalachians, in an old mill town that used to have industry and doesn't anymore. Just south of where I live is one of the really poor parts of town. It is a mixed race part of town, by which I don't just mean there are some black people here, some white people here. You walk down on a summer afternoon, and the people sitting on a porch downing some beers are not of the same skin color. There are a lot of mixed race couples. There are a lot of multiracial children there. It's very, very poor. This was the first neighborhood in town where Donald Trump signs started appearing. Okay? All the Hillary Clinton signs were in the rich part of town. I've seen that repeated over a vast amount of middle America, all over the flyover states, precisely because, the people who are well off could afford to think that, okay, well, we can just go for another 4 years of the same thing. The people who are not well off, the 80% of Americans who are struggling these days, they can't afford another 4 years of business as usual, and they were willing to vote for anybody who would promise them something different.
Mm-hmm. And
It's,
Dmitry?
it's dangerous to oversimplify, but perhaps sometimes it's useful. So as an engineer, I like to draw diagrams, and I drew a Venn diagram, and in one circle is people able to win the Republican primary, and the other one is people able to lose against Hillary Clinton. And the overlap between the two circles turns out to be a null set. So that made Trump inevitable.
Yes. I don't think he was inevitable because Clinton did win the popular vote. But there were about three different things. I think you're absolutely right. One was the class effect, that people were hurting. And white people are hurting. I mean, it's nothing new for black folks to be hurting. But white folks were hurting who were being ignored and who still are being ignored by both parties. Yeah. And the class effect. Also, what Trump ran on was against Wall Street. You remember that? He was running against, he was going to trade the swamp. Of all folks, he was going to trade the swamp. And the third thing was immigration. We don't want to, it's like the boogeyman in the room. If we're going to talk about reality, we're going to talk, as if there is one view on immigration and that it's that immigrants and this whole issue is whether the good guys and the bad guys. It's try to make it a factor of one, or either one against the other. It's either for it or you're against it. And not recognize that it's a multifaceted kind of thing. That there are people, there are Americans who are hurted. That that labor is not exempt from the law of supply and demand.
Thank you.
And the other thing, which we don't talk about, and Trump didn't really talk about it. He didn't talk about it well. He could have exploited it. But that in reality, Americans really have sort of written off some of the folks who actually are hurt by the immigration. If we're talking about the National Academy of Science study, it's less skilled, less educated, African Americans, Hispanic, and in the workforce. And increasingly, the limits of options that affect when you have deindustrialization now, increasingly you have, especially in the Rust Belt, white workers who are also now caught in this downward spiral, and jobs that are not simply available, and even the lower level jobs are not available, because when you have 8.5 million illegal workers working and 8 million Americans looking for jobs of any kind, and another 3 to 4 million who want full-time employment, you've got an issue that deserves to be addressed not as an either or, good or bad, but as a recognition that choices have to be made, that when you make certain choices, others are hurt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to build on what Frank was saying there, about 1970, the ability of a single earner to support a household hit a peak, and it's been going down ever since for the median income at this point in time. Mm-hmm. To me, Trump was all but inevitable, and my flip statement now to people is, if we don't correct the monetary policies in this country, which are deeply unfair, deeply. Remember, it was last year, Oxfam ran a study and found that 62 people had as much wealth as 3.5 billion people on the planet. They ran the study this year, in 2016, last year, and that number was just 8. So, and they pretend like, oh, isn't this just it's like a comet flew by, weird, right? No, this is a policy. The reason those people got wealthier, the reason the 0.1% are getting wealthier is because of policies of the Federal Reserve that are taking economic oxygen away from everybody and handing it to a very small group of people. That's not monetary policy, that is social engineering and it's political engineering. It has consequences, and we're seeing it all over the world. Marine Le Pen in France, I'll guarantee she's going to get more votes than they're predicting for the same reason that Trump did. People are embarrassed to admit it, but they're feeling the pain, right? Italy, same thing. Brexit, same thing. Mm-hmm. These are all connected events, and until we understand that landscape, you can parse down into, was it white voters or black voters or this? Forget that. We're being deeply unfairly treated by a system that I think Hillary represented in spades. Mm-hmm. Trump pretended like he was something different, but all the Goldman Sachs people he's brought on board maybe says he wasn't that different. But my flip answer is, if you don't like who Trump was, you're going to hate who comes next, unless we fix this. Because that unfairness is easy for somebody to come along and promise the world to, and that person might not be somebody we like very much. But that's really the context I see in this story.
Yeah, me too.
Well, Trump won the election because Hillary won bigly in the wrong states and lost bigly in the right states. And both Trump and Hillary represented the incoherence of our economic system, because the incoherence of our economic system is kind of bleeding over now, being expressed by our politics. And there's a very important word that we don't use when we're talking about what's going on in our country, and that word is racketeering. Everything has turned into a racket in the American economy and in American political and social life. And I think the voters very clearly recognized that Hillary Clinton represented political racketeering at its most visible. And she alienated the voters that way. For all the lack of finesse in Hillary's campaign that John Michael described, let's remember that Trump was extraordinarily incoherent during the campaign and remains incoherent as president. And I don't think that he's going to be able to either articulate the true nature of the problems that we're faced with or navigate us through it. And we do have reason to be pretty concerned about what comes next. I also don't think that he's going to make it through his entire term. So we have a big problem in this country. I would summarize it by saying this. We don't have a coherent idea of what's happening to us. We can't construct a coherent narrative about the reality that we inhabit, and we can't produce a coherent plan for what to do.
Jim, I just want to say,
Go ahead.
following through what you just said about racketeering, Hillary was perceived as the continuation of the Obama administration. And what we don't want to often acknowledge, at least some of us who voted for him in 2008, was that his refusal to either to prosecute those who were in violation of Geneva Convention rules on one hand, or the absolute fraud, and it was clearly fraud, of the financial, the Holder and Obama, is a reinforcement of that also was beneath the surface that people clearly felt that affected the Democrats.
And I like to use the term to describe what our society became as a result of that, as a society in which anything goes and nothing matters. And that's a very dangerous place for society to get.
Amen.
Yeah.
I think that I want to pick up on what Frank said, which is that the perception is very important. And Donald Trump is the most pessimistic president and was the most pessimistic presidential candidate that I've ever witnessed. The whole slogan of Make America Great Again means that America isn't that great anymore. Now, whether it can be made great again, you know, he'll maybe try, but he's more interested in destroying things that don't work than in building things that do. Look at what he's doing to Obamacare. He said, well, Obamacare is going to just explode, crash and burn. It's already happening. Eventually, people will be paying ridiculously high premiums, and their deductibles are higher than the amount of money they have. So, ergo, they're not going to get any medical care anyway. So why not just let it explode? That was his plan A. His plan B was to try some kind of reform. Plan B failed. Now it's back to plan A. So he's just a completely pessimistic person. But the reason it works is because it's a completely pessimistic country. So the people are fed up listening to optimists when that optimism is completely unsubstantiated by the reality that the people experience in their daily lives. So he was a breath of fresh air because he's a pessimist.
So it goes from new morning in America or a new dawn in America to let's make America great again,
Maybe.
because it isn't.
But wasn't that an optimistic statement? Because he was saying it to people that America was great at a certain time when things were better for them, but maybe not for all Americans. But it was certainly better. But in the most benign part, it was great when there was manufacturing jobs, where you get a high school education, you can get things and so forth like that. The malignant part, of course, was that for many of the folks who were during those times, Americans who were not benefiting from that.
Well, it's nostalgia. It's,
Yes.
you know, it's basically it's a return to nostalgia. It has to be an optimistic slogan because this is America, and here optimism is obligatory. But this is very pessimistic sort of optimism, if you really look at it.
Well, I think part of it is simply that Donald Trump was one of the very few people who was willing to admit that there was actually a problem to be solved.
Exactly.
I mean, over and above, is it optimism? Well, you know, make America great again. Actually admitting, I mean, you recall the flurry when he mentioned in an interview, somebody said, well, Vladimir Putin is a killer. And he was saying, well, yeah, we've got lots of killers too. And people wet themselves. People just wet themselves because you don't talk that way about the United States, even though, of course, he's true. Or he's right in that situation. He was telling the truth, which is not what we expect from our politicians.
But John,
Yeah.
how can, why did Trump win in the Republican Party when Bernie didn't win in the Democratic Party?
Because the Republican Party is more democratic than the Democratic Party.
That's
The Republican Party was not able to squeeze him out, while the Democrats rigged the primary, blatantly, which is why we don't have President Sanders right now. I'm quite convinced that if Bernie Sanders had gotten the nomination that he earned, that the result, he would have walked right over Trump. You have two candidates promising change, and one of them actually looks like he'll deliver. he would have won. I know people who voted for Trump who said, yeah, I kind of like Sanders. I know of nobody who voted for Trump who could stand Hillary Clinton. And, you know, it's not a matter of gender. Many of these people they have female politicians that they like a great deal, just not that one.
Well, and she was, to me, a continuation of more of the same, right? Which was highly corrupt and deeply unfair, right? So the same time Ferguson is exploding and we're discovering, the Department of Justice comes into Ferguson after that whole Michael Brown shooting and discovered in a town of 20,000 people, there were 16,000 outstanding warrants.
Yep.
The people were walking ATMs to a corrupt, venal justice system where the cops and the courts were treating everybody who was walking around like they could get some extractable cash from. So the law works for us, but it wasn't working for Goldman Sachs, right? And so Hillary was just a continuation of that for me. And what was really interesting was looking at the Sanders rallies. Yes, they were 10 times larger than Hillary, and that's being generous to Hillary, right? Maybe 100 times larger in some cases.
In some cases, yes.
But the age demographic clearly showed the same thing that we saw with Ron Paul, who also surprised me. 30 and under, that's his crowd.
Exactly.
Old white guy is crazy, right? But what is said is we have a looming generational storm coming here where the young people don't see anything, including my children. They look in the future and they say, hang on, D- infrastructure, student debt, the only non-dischargeable form of debt in America today, crumbling this and that. You know, it's just, what did you guys spend the money on? And I think the boomers have a lot to answer for. And there was a whole attempt to just pretend that wasn't the case. We're stronger together. That was the slogan. I'm like, that hasn't been true so far, so like, can we start over with that one?
No,
so that's what both of them, you know, I worked as a corporate strategist for a long time. In a strategy, there's fancy things you can do, and they're all the same. Where are you going? How are you going to get there? What's your vision? What are your resources? I haven't seen anything from either party that says, here's where we want to go and why, and here's how we're going to get there. With the energy we have remaining, with the dollars we have yet to spend, all of that stuff, it's just, that's missing. And for young people to come into a story, we're asking them, hey, step in enthusiastically into this American dream narrative. And it hasn't been explained, and it doesn't make sense. That's the world we live in. That's uncomfortable, and that's where I think a lot of people are starting to feel that deep discomfort that you get when your main story is broken and nobody's talking about it.
And it seems like it's starting to manifest politically now. Just the other day, I was having coffee with someone who mentioned a young woman who was running for the school board here. She's in her 20s, and she really doesn't want to align with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. She really sees herself more as an independent, maybe more leaning to the Democratic Party, but things are changing. And I love where this discussion is going because I think we're down this great rabbit hole where, you know, there's some things that we can't talk about and other things we can. And I'd like to quote something from Krista Freeland. She wrote a book called The Plutocrats, The Rise of the New Global Super Rich and the Fall of Everyone Else. She said, and I quote, "I was once told by the head of a prestigious think tank in Washington, D.C., that the think tank's board was very unlikely to fund any work that had income or wealth inequality in its title. Yes, they would finance anything to do with poverty alleviation, but inequality was an altogether different matter." Why is that? Why can't, like you had mentioned, you know, Trump said something that people just don't say. Why can't we have that conversation on inequality and what is driving it?
Well, now it's very easy to talk about the 0.1%, okay? And it's very popular to focus the entire conversation about class in America as though it's just the top 1% or 0.01% versus everyone else. What we don't want to talk about is the differentiation between the upper 20% and everyone else. Between, let's use some simple labels, the salary class, the people who get their income primarily by salary, and the wage class, the people who earn an hourly wage. There are huge differences. There are huge differences in how they've been treated over the last 30 years. If you're in the salary class, unless you're right down at the bottom being pushed out into wage work, your health care is probably paid for by your employer. If you're in wage class, forget it. If you're in the salary class, you're doing about as well as people did in the salary class 20 years ago. If you're in the wage class, your income has been destroyed. You may be working 3 jobs, part-time, minimum wage, no benefits, in a desperate attempt to keep your family fed. That's the reality in the wage class these days. And nobody wants to talk about that Because we have to start talking about inequalities that don't just have to do with snidely whiplash in the 0.01%. We can't just point off somewhere else at some other person being evil. We have to look at ourselves. We have to look at our own lifestyles. We have to say, okay, is my lifestyle being propped up by the destruction of the working class? And guess what? If you're in the salary class, yes, it has been. You've benefited by the destruction of the American working class.
Is that
And
because
nobody-
people get their lawns done for cheap and
Economic policy in the United States for the since Ronald Reagan came in, around in 1981, has been focused on keeping the middle class happy by driving down the price of everything, and that requires offshoring jobs to third world hellholes so that they can be made cheaply. It involves
Tax cuts.
Yeah, exactly. Tax cuts. It involves importing labor at the bottom to drive. Again, you were talking about the law of supply and demand. It applies to labor. If you increase the supply of laborers and you decrease the demand for laborers, guess what? Wages go down. And it sounds really good if you're sitting in a corporate boardroom and saying, yeah, our labor costs have gone down by 15%. But what that means is that people who are depending on those wages to feed their children no longer have the income they need. And so basically the acquiescence, the compliance of the middle class for the social changes has been purchased at the expense of throwing America's once strong working class under the bus and then driving the wheels back and forth across it for 30 years.
Well, I want to say something about the
Go ahead.
what you're painting as a victim class, the working class, because another way that we don't talk about this is how they have been compliant in their own destruction. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, I went around to a lot of permitting meetings in the town planning boards for Walmarts and big box stores. And invariably, there would be a group of working people there saying, "We want bargain shopping. We want bargain shopping." And so they would force the town board to let the Walmart come into their town, and the Walmart would destroy every small business in the town. And then, a lot of these people were out of jobs forever. And so I think that there's plenty of blame to spread around. And it's important to realize how we have authored the destruction of our own society. And it's not just the complacence of the salary class. It goes across the whole society.
But the complacence of the salary
really
class
deeper.
has.
It's really deeper than that.
Yeah.
At the root of this, Americans don't talk about equality because Americans worship individualism. There's not a belief in a social contract or the fake ideology of the Judeo-Christian Islamic society. That's really not really what Americans believe in. You're right, it's materialism. But this individualism is very important for Americans because by focusing on individualisms, you can justify whatever class status you have as a result of you or your ancestors' drive, determination, denial of gratification. You ignore both historical and structural barriers that, finally some people realize, you realize that up against, you're more likely to realize these barriers when they happen to you when you're out of a job and when you're out faced by these other kinds of structural things that are brought about to support the 1.5%. But until then, there's this assumption. And it really hurts our children because they're growing up. They see the differences in our society. And if they are not taught that so much of this reality is not true, the reality that assumes that America is a meritocratic society, the reality that assumes that upward mobility in America is one of the best in all the developed world when it really isn't, then they have no other basis of understanding these differences. And so they become susceptible to these arguments that, that artificial categories like race or like class are not due to structural policies and things, but are due to individual weaknesses.
Yeah, exactly.
So therefore, if I'm benefiting from that, if I want to believe that, if I don't want to believe that I'm or my family is a result of privileged history, that's threatening to me when you when you do that. So it's much more acceptable to believe in this this myth that everything is individual responsibility, you know, and that we live in the most open, vibrant, like what we're all around here are saying, the most open, vibrant, health, best in the world health kinds of reality that is not reality.
I think I have a short answer to the question that you posed originally. Why is the subject of inequality rarely discussed, or why discussion of that subject is not encouraged at all? And I think that that's because inequality in the United States is actually an engineered product. If you start out poor, then making a little bit more money means that you're going to lose your subsidized housing. You're going to lose your free care, whatever free care you manage to get. You're not going to get food stamps. All of these things are basically headwinds. And all you have to do to generate those headwinds is start making more money. So a lot of people in the United States are smart enough to know that they have something to gain by staying poor. And this has been organized. This has been put into place. Other policies that destroy families by making fathers irrelevant or sending them to jail for various victimless crimes. All of those things are basically designed to make it so that the poor want to stay poor. Now, discussing that is politically very charged. It's a very fraught subject. People don't want to think that they're actually creating an underclass with their social policies. And I think that that's the reason that these think tanks shy away from the subject.
Well, especially when a lot of those policies are put in place with good intentions. I mean, let's not delude ourselves into thinking that these things were engineered necessarily by evil spirits who wanted to do harm to those people. A lot of that stuff was done with the best of intentions.
Well,
and that's one of the reasons we can't really talk about it, because the shame and disappointment of the failure of those policies is so tremendous that we can't have an honest conversation
But
about
guys,
it.
what am I missing here? I mean, I don't know of any poor people who want to stay poor. They're in a system to survive. And when they're trying to survive, they develop many kinds of different mechanisms. But it's not out of a choice. Matter of fact, many of them, and I go across race on there, identify with the rich. Oh, they believe this. Oh, no, we don't want to overtax the rich. That's incentive for that. I've seen the poor more identify with sometimes those who are bringing oppression than want to stay. They want to be out of that. They don't
absolutely.
Want. They don't want.
I don't think
What
either
I'm-
of us
what
are
I'm
making
sa-
the point that they
No,
want to stay
yeah,
poor.
what I'm
Okay.
saying is that you're absolutely right. That culturally poverty is extremely unattractive across the board. The problem is you make more money, it makes you more poor. That's the trap, and because that trap is built into how poverty is financed, it is very difficult for a lot of people to escape from that trap. You have to leapfrog over
Much more money.
huge
You've got to
pay
make
scale. You have to
considerably
go from
additional.
0 to 6 figures somehow.
Well, not quite 6 figures.
Well,
but
6 figures is where people feel comfortable in this kind of
Well, the break-even line in my county in Massachusetts, because I know somebody who's on disability, she's been there a while, she would have to earn $48,500 to equal the benefits that come from being on disability, on
Medicare and so forth.
Massachusetts Health, Medicare,
Yes.
all of that.
Yes.
And that's a tall order in a county where our median income for a household, which is 2 earners, is less than that.
Yes. Now, the interesting thing here is that this focus on individualism doesn't actually go back all that far in American history. When Alexis de Tocqueville toured this country in the decades immediately after the revolution, one of the things he commented on was the extent to which Americans organized groups to do everything. Any kind of thing they wanted to do, whether it was to build a church, to do civic improvements, to do this, to do that.
Hold funerals?
Yeah, exactly. Provide sick pay back when there was no social safety net. Americans were at the cutting edge of social organization. As recently as the middle of the 20th century, when the union movement was big, there was this idea that there was strength in numbers. You join together. You don't try to go it on your own because you'll be crushed. And somehow that got lost.
Yeah.
And I think one of the angles that could be pursued, that ought to be pursued perhaps, in figuring out how people can get themselves out of the mess that we're in, because the help is not going to be handed down by the people who are already privileged.
And there have been a loss of organizational strengths too.
Oh, I know.
I'm just speaking the African American community, things which I guess from segregation forced this unity. Sometimes that led to some of the black colleges. Sometimes it was the black women's groups. Sometimes the black fraternities, the black Masonic groups. Many of these things are now have weakened, as Putnam in his book Bowling Alone shows. So, and I think that, but we haven't recognized that. You know, it's as if this is concurrently going on, and things are going on around us, and no one has any answers, or no one is willing to recognize.
By the way, a lot of the poverty and economic issues also fall into the racketeering folder. Let's not forget that.
Amen.
Yeah.
I don't think you have to go all the way back to Alexis de Tocqueville to find an America that, was the can-do nation that made things work, that carried, basically cared a lot about results and didn't care too much about whose feelings got hurt along the way. That was the America that I saw when I came here in the 70s. It was tough people that got things done. And now you have soft people who care about their own feelings. That's a big shift. That's a big cultural shift.
Interesting.
And that was engineered in the universities, I
think
believe.
so, yes.
I don't know about this, the soft people, because folks are struggling. And when you're struggling, you either, if you're in charge, it's racketeering. If you're not, you're hustling to survive. So, so both of them require a great deal of emphasis, of energy, and a different kind of way of trying to adjust to power.
Now, that thing, though, about not talking about it, why don't we talk about it? I'm at the point now, I think it's gone beyond an oversight. This is an active policy of suppressing this discussion of inequality. Nobody wants to be accused of starting a class war. But let's be clear, 2014, Janet Yellen, chairman of the Federal Reserve, gets up and gives a talk, and she talked directly about inequality and gave 3 prime reasons for it. One was early childhood education, need to do better at it. Number 2, Americans needed to be more entrepreneurial. Number 3, it really helps if you had a big inheritance coming from your parents. I kid you not, those were the factors she identified, and she is, number 1, more responsible for the wealth inequality than anybody else. She blamed the victim, and nobody in the press said anything but, those are real good pearls of insight, Ms. Yellen. We'll write them all down.
Yeah.
Right? The first thing should have been somebody standing there going, BS, that is complete junk. It's astonishing that we have so little context in our media that she could get away with saying that, and nobody said anything except the blogosphere.
Yeah. Here again, though, I think one of the problems, and this is something we also saw very substantially with the whole Trump business, the echo chamber of the privileged. Okay? There are things you don't talk about if you're comfortable in this country. Inequality is a major one of them. You don't talk about systemic issues like that. The amount of things that you can talk about has actually narrowed dramatically. Dmitry, you're a specialist on the last years of the Soviet Union. To what extent did that kind of thing spread through the Soviet media and Soviet conversation at the same time, where among the people whose voices were available to the public?
Well, during the final agony of the Soviet Union, nothing was discussed, and then Gorbachev came to power and announced this policy of glasnost. You would no longer get persecuted or locked up by speaking the truth. And what erupted was this basically nervous breakdown on the scale of a large nuclear superpower that caused it to fall apart relatively quickly. A lot of what passed for truth was actually, fake news in contemporary parlance. All sorts of numbers got exaggerated. People got a really bad impression of what their country was actually like. They lost track of what was good about it. It was not a net positive for the country as a whole. I think it was necessary because what came before was just this protocol where you receive a sheet of instructions and you read from it, and everybody else has to nod. That didn't work very well. but what came after didn't work very well either.
Oh, yeah. The opposite of one bad idea is usually another bad idea.
Exactly. But I think right now we have two things going on in this country. One is that there's the echo chamber of mass media and people in the Beltway and people on Wall Street, and they're in a world of their own. They live in some kind of a manufactured reality which no longer connects in any way with physical reality. And then you have everybody else being very confused, legitimately confused, because nobody's telling them what to think, and they haven't been trained to think for themselves.
They've been trained not to think for themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
With
how long
terrible costs, especially if we look at the work of Deaton and Case from Princeton about the increasing death rate of white male Americans with college degrees or less. You know, African Americans have also suffered from this environment, but it's been much longer. And you know, we've adjusted with very negative social consequences that are now beginning to, you know, to hit deeper in America and in rural America too. You know,
Oh, yes.
that's so there are consequences of that.
Earlier, someone had mentioned that, you know, if you're concerned about Trump, wait if he fails, wait to see what happens, what comes along next. And, you know, often when I'm a little confused about what's going on in the world, I pick up Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian Wars, and it all just seems to be that playing out again. We have the rise of these, you know, where you had the rise of demagogues, you know, people who, you know, again, people were confused at the time. There were suffering. And there were these very talented individuals that were able to arise, maybe not necessarily competent, but very talented, who could arise, attract their attention, and get them to support them politically. And that could be dangerous.
It is dangerous. But it's something that happens at this. Here we're going to get into awkward territory, which is that history does rhyme. And the conviction that history has nothing to teach us except the mistakes that people made way back then when we were all stupid. We have to get past that. We have to recognize that we are in a kind of historical period, a kind of phenomenon that has happened many times before. If you want to go back to Polybius, the Greek historian, who talked about how democracies come unglued. And you'll get a very familiar glimpse. The one way in which that tends to get brought out is that everybody likes to talk about Weimar Germany. Everyone likes to paint the little square mustache on whatever politician they don't like. And that can be useful on occasion. But we're taught this is a broader situation. This is how democracies decline and fall. I know those are probably the two least favorite words in modern American parlance, but that happens.
I think that there's a lot of psychological value to reading Suetonius, Polybius, people like that. When George Bush got elected and there was this march to war, you know, they were preparing to invade Afghanistan before 9/11, believe it or not. I realized that this was happening, and it made me sick. And the way I overcame this nausea that all of this produced as me was by reading the 12 Caesars. And that made me realize that, you know, this just goes around in circles, doesn't it? And this is just more of the same. So nothing to worry about, just like, you know, take care of your own business, and this will get even worse. And there's nothing we can do to stop it.
And that's the unthinkable thing, because of the sort of toxic optimism that has become so pervasive in our society. Everything has to be upbeat. We have to put fish hooks in our lips and draw them up into a rictus and pretend that nothing can ever be wrong, that we're on our way to some kind of imaginary Star Trek future metastasizing across the galaxy or something, when we're not.
And it's not working. That's what
It's
I
not
would
working.
point out.
It's not
Hillary
working.
Clinton is Mrs. Rictus. You know, you look at how she smiles. That's not a smile. That's called rictus. It's a medical term. It's a nervous grimace. The woman is incapable of smiling.
I've never met her. I wouldn't know. But the thing is, we have this folk mythology of perpetual progress glued into place in our imaginations, and the fact that progress could be followed by regress, that rise is followed by decline and fall, is unthinkable to most Americans, and yet that's the reality we're experiencing right now.
And we do
Black
have-
Americans do not.
I get it. Let's get it straight. Thank you for the correction. And I'm sure that's true of most people of color. They know better. But their voices are not the ones being fed back to us all through the echo chamber of the media. And so we have this fantasy that you can be on the right side of history. How often have we heard that label recently? History doesn't have sides. It doesn't play favorites. It's not going anywhere. But we believe it is because we have this folk mythology of progress that we insist on mapping, even as our infrastructure collapses, even as our standards of living slide, even as the biosphere comes unglued. We've got
Food
progress.
uncertainty.
Well, let me pick up on that
Go ahead,
because
run with it.
I've been playing the role of the Lorax in all the talks I go and give. I gave a talk at NASA during one of their 100-year planning cycles, at the UN, variety of places. And I start my talk now with the rusty patch bumblebee. The rusty patch bumblebee is now on the endangered species list. Fish and Wildlife put it there. Do you know who fought that tooth and nail? The one lobbying group that fought the inclusion of the bumblebee hardest?
Who?
It's the American Farm Bureau. How far off the reservation are you when the Farm Bureau is the one fighting the inclusion of the bumblebee, which is an essential creature, right? So to me, that just hits me in the gut. Like, that actually makes me very upset. This is the part of the story where I cry. I get really, my heart is broken by the idea of the loss of sentinel species, not because they perform essential pollination services that make us billions of dollars of tomatoes, but because it's a bumblebee and it has a place in life. And so I give this talk, and at NASA I expected a little of this, but I usually get somebody in the audience going, oh, Chris, they're making